In this video, you'll learn the story of how Rwanda restored its landscapes for biodiversity and for people. A country that experienced terrible events, but it's one that has sought to intentionally move forward, to set ambitious goals and work towards them. There are actually many similarities between Rwanda and Britain, and of course there are differences, and we're going to explore them, and we're going to get to the heart of what the UK can learn from Rwanda's rewilding, regenerative, restoration, remarkable story. I put in too many R's there, I'm sorry. In 1994, the country experienced one of the most horrific genocides in history. In just a 100-day period, over 800,000 people were massacred. Vile and demonic acts unfolded, and with nearly 1 million dead and the whole country displaced, Rwanda was ripped apart. This isn't the video, nor is it the channel to explain what happened with the genocide. I just wanted you to know what the people had to experience because it makes the story all the more admirable. It was also during this time that the country was experiencing rapid urbanization, which had increased since 1990 by 300%, and the population had quadrupled since 1960. These demands of a growing population, with many of the communities and people reliant upon subsistence agriculture, this started to put huge pressures on Rwanda's landscapes. Rwanda is the land known as 1,000 hills, and the need to produce food and fuel led to the cultivation of these hills, which ultimately led to their degradation through erosion, and forests were cleared, and Rwanda's once fertile soils were turning to desert, completely overwhelmed, and with Rwanda's people entering poverty, it was time to act. With so many reliant upon the lands, Rwanda knew that they had to restore it, and an early key player in Rwanda's restoration was their willingness to adopt forest landscape restoration. FLR is a dynamic approach to restoring landscapes for people and biodiversity, and at its heart is tree planting. It's all about building resilient ecosystems that can face challenges like a rising population. To facilitate this border-to-border restoration, the government created new and revised old policies and legislations. A strategy, a framework to environmental, social and economic transformation, and it was called Vision 2020. And it was around this time that they became the first African nation to become part of the Global Bond Challenge, which is a global goal that seeks to restore 150 million hectares of degraded land. Rwanda themselves pledged 2 million hectares, and for it to be achieved as part of the 2020 vision. With these ambitious goals set, Rwanda took 2 years to carefully assess where to restore, finding that they would need to use agroforestry to the degraded slopes and hills, convert and optimize eucalyptus woodlots for timber production, and to restore deforested lands with native species, and to rehabilitate existing natural woodlands. With stringent planning backing up these ambitious goals, and with funding secured, Rwanda set to work, and what followed was immense progress. Great political decisions and rules were made. To reduce the poaching of animals, communities living closest to the national parks received 5% of the income. By 2008, all plastic bags were banned, just completely banned, and all of the rivers, they said we need to allow for a 20-meter buffer zone. And they also took great pride in reintroducing lions to their national parks, and annually they hold a week-long event for their mountain gorillas, who they also have naming ceremonies for when babies are born, and naming ceremonies in Rwanda are culturally significant. But at the very heart of the country's recovery was forest landscape restoration, particularly agroforestry, which is a form of land management that incorporates and harvests trees and shrubs among crops and pasture lands. Across the globe, its application and its uses are different, but for the people of Rwanda, who rely so much on the land for their food and for their fuel, it completely transformed their lives, as well as bolstering the environment, stopping all of that erosion and degradation of the landscapes, and it also did a good thing for biodiversity. Now, I just want to draw some similarities from these former problems of Rwanda and what we're seeing here today in the UK. We'll also, of course, look at the differences too, and we'll get a good idea of what the UK can learn. So Rwanda is actually much smaller. It's around 1/10 of the UK size, but both countries are densely populated. And Rwanda's is actually much greater at 525 people per kilometre, and the UK's is at 281 people per kilometre. By comparison to the UK, Rwanda is poor. They just don't have the same resources. And when you consider these factors, it makes their restoration story all the more impressive. And between the two countries, there are of course many differences. How society functions, how the climate works. Unlike Rwanda, as a country, the people of the UK, they they don't rely on the local landscape in quite the same way, because much of our food, much of our fuel has to travel great distances to get to us. We don't rely on the local landscape nearly as much as we should. I guess that's the privilege of living in a wealthy society, but it's damaging our environment. But the problems that both countries face, or the problems that Rwanda faced, are the same. A rising population with increasing demands and a degraded and depleted landscape that is underachieving economically and environmentally. The State of Nature report found that 41% of all UK species are in decline. Natural ecosystems have been lost and continue to be lost to land use change. It's a combination of urbanisation, forestry and agriculture, but most notably agriculture, because it impacts over 70% of all UK land. And 70% is a huge area, and until recently, all farms in the UK were incentivised to be as productive as possible, and that means damaging the environment through pesticides, clearing natural habitats to sustain more farmland, and just a punishing regime year after year. And economically, it's benefited just a few, with the diversity of opportunities and jobs in rural areas being reliant upon just the agricultural and forestry sectors, which are in this country segregated. They're not one and the same like they should be. If you look at the roadmap that Rwanda took to success and then compare where the UK is, we'll get a good idea of what we need to do. So firstly, they identified the problem. They knew that something was wrong and it had to change. Secondly, they made goals and they assessed the landscape to figure out what to do, and they made new policies to empower those goals. And thirdly, they just carried it out, but they had stringent assessments along the way to figure out what was working and where still needed more work. So the UK knows about the problem. We've got report upon findings and research that has led to us to set these ambitious goals. We've even got all of the funding to help us get there. But what we haven't seen is the changes, the clear and meaningful changes in policies and strategies that are going to get us to achieve these goals or come close to achieving these goals. The environmental land management scheme will be one of our best shots at achieving landscape scale restoration. However, it is still in its infant phase. It's rolling out, but the agenda does look promising. They're saying that woodland creation will be trebled and that things like agroforestry will be supported. But we're not there yet, and it really will be this decade that we see if the ELM scheme is a success. So ultimately, what can the UK learn from Rwanda's success story? Firstly, don't wait for things to get really bad before you do something about them. We need to create and revise policies and legislations, the rules. We need to make rules that support things like agroforestry and rewilding that are really going to help our landscapes recover and prosper. And I think, like the people of Rwanda, we need to have more pride in our ecological landscape, particularly for the large animals, the apex predators like the wolves and the lynx that really should be here. If it weren't for us hunting them to extinction, they should be here, and we should honour that. We should learn from the self-sufficient nature of the people and how they work with the local landscape to provide things like food and fuel, and it brings communities together. I mean, almost every house in the UK has a garden. Why aren't households being incentivized and encouraged to start growing food, you know, instead of just like ripping out all the plants, laying down artificial grass, concrete, and just driving to the shops and buying food that comes from halfway around the world? Systemic change is required, and typically those kind of changes take a long time, but Rwanda has shown us that if we work together, it doesn't take nearly as long. Thank you so much for watching. Live curious.